At 7:06 in the morning on June 16, 1943, a B-17 Flying Fortress, called Old 666, crossed into the most heavily defended stretch of airspace in the entire Pacific Theater. 25,000 feet over Bougainville Island, deep inside Japanese-controlled territory, alone, with no fighter escort. The crew had volunteered for this mission knowing the odds. Intelligence had calculated the expected fighter opposition at somewhere between 15 and 20 Japanese Zeros, maybe more. There were 10 men aboard Old 666. The pilot was Captain Jay Zeamer Jr., 26 years old, 6 feet tall. A man his commanding officers had once considered a complete washout, too reckless, too unconventional, too difficult to manage. He had been passed over for command so many times that he had been forced to build his own crew from scratch. Every single man on Old 666 was a volunteer. Every single one had been rejected, reassigned, or overlooked by someone else. The mission was simple on paper. Fly over Bougainville, photograph the Japanese airfields and harbor at Buka, and return with the intelligence needed to plan a major Allied offensive. It was not simple in practice. What happened in the next 40 minutes would leave Old 666 so riddled with cannon fire that ground crews later counted more than 180 holes in the fuselage. 5 of the 10 crew members would be wounded. The bomber would lose 2 engines. One gunner would have both legs shattered by 20mm cannon fire and keep shooting from his turret for another hour. And Jay Zeamer, bleeding from wounds in both legs and one arm, would fly that dying aircraft for over 500 miles through continued fighter attacks, through the threat of complete systems failure, through unconsciousness itself, until every single member of his crew was safe. He had been told he would never amount to anything as a pilot. He had been told Old 666 was a junk heap not worth flying. He had been told this mission was probably a one-way trip. He flew it anyway, and not one man died. Jay Zeamer Jr. was not supposed to be a hero. He was born on July 25, 1918, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the son of a businessman, raised in a comfortable, ordinary American household. Nothing in his early life suggested he would one day fly a disintegrating bomber through a swarm of Japanese fighters above the Solomon Islands. He graduated from MIT in 1940 with a degree in civil engineering. Smart, technically gifted, precise. The kind of man the Army Air Forces actively wanted. Zeamer enlisted shortly after Pearl Harbor and reported for pilot training. He was a natural in the cockpit, smooth, confident, capable. His instructors noted his spatial awareness, his instinct for the aircraft's limits, his willingness to push right up to those limits without crossing them. But Zeamer had a problem. 2 of them, actually. First, he was obsessed with gunnery. While other pilots focused on formation, flying, and instrument procedures, Zeamer spent every spare hour at the gun ranges. He wanted to understand how his aircraft's weapons worked, how they were maintained, what made them fail. His commanding officers found this peculiar. Pilots flew, gunners shot. Zeamer didn't seem to understand the difference. Second, he had a habit of borrowing aircraft without permission. Not stealing, borrowing. He would find an unscheduled aircraft, file a flight plan quietly, and take it up for practice runs, gunnery exercises, navigation training. He logged hundreds of hours this way. Hours that made him an extraordinary pilot. Hours that made his superiors quietly furious. The result was a service record full of contradictions. Exceptional skill. Repeated disciplinary notes. Passed over for promotion. Passed over for command. Moved from unit to unit across the Pacific Theater. Always a co-pilot, never a captain. By mid-1942, Jay Zeamer was in the Southwest Pacific with the 43rd Bombardment Group, flying B-17s over New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. He was good enough that no one could justify removing him. He was unconventional enough that no one wanted to give him his own crew. So, Zeamer did something unusual. He found a bomber nobody else wanted and claimed it as his own. Old 666 was, by most accounts, a disaster. The aircraft, officially B-17E serial number 41-2666, had been so badly damaged in combat that it had been pulled from active service and left on the Finey maintenance line at Port Moresby. Other crews walked past it without a second glance. The fuselage was patched. The engines needed constant attention. The instruments were unreliable. Zeamer saw potential. Over the following weeks, he and a small group of mechanics rebuilt Old 666 from the inside out. They installed additional gun positions, including a modified nose turret that gave the aircraft more forward firepower than any other B-17 in the theater. They overhauled the engines. They rewired systems. They patched, replaced, and reinforced until Old 666 was something it had never been before, not a standard bomber, but a heavily armed reconnaissance platform designed by people who understood exactly what kind of opposition they would face. Then Zeamer built his crew. He found them the same way he'd found the aircraft, by looking for the ones nobody else wanted. Bombardier Joseph Sarnosky was one of the best in the group, but had a reputation for bluntness that rubbed officers the wrong way. Navigator Johnny Abel was meticulous and skilled, but had been shuffled between assignments without ever finding a permanent home. The gunners were a collection of volunteers, replacements, and men who had simply decided they wanted to fly with Zeamer because he seemed like someone who knew what he was doing. 10 men, 10 volunteers, one rebuilt junk heap of a bomber. Between late 1942 and June 1943, Zeamer and his crew flew 47 combat missions over some of the most dangerous airspace in the Pacific. They photographed Japanese positions. They flew reconnaissance routes that other crews considered suicide runs. They came back every time. They built a reputation quietly, the way real reputations are built, not through self-promotion, but through results. By June 1943, Allied Command was preparing a major offensive in the Solomon Islands. To support it, they needed detailed photographic intelligence of Japanese positions on Bougainville Island. Specifically, the airfields and harbor installations at Buka, at the northern tip of the island. The problem was that Buka was the most heavily defended position in the region. Japanese fighter strength at the nearby airfields was estimated at over 70 aircraft. Any reconnaissance mission over Buka would face immediate, overwhelming interception. Most crews declined. The math was too brutal. Zeamer volunteered. Old 666 lifted off from Dobadura Airfield in New Guinea at 4 o'clock in the morning on June 16, 1943. The aircraft climbed slowly through the pre-dawn darkness, heavy with fuel and camera equipment. Zeamer took it up to 25,000 feet over the Bismarck Sea and turned northwest toward Bougainville. The crew settled into their positions. The gunners test-fired their weapons. Navigator Johnny Abel tracked their course against the stars. No one spoke much. They all knew what was coming. Old 666 crossed the coast of Bougainville at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning. The island appeared beneath them as a dark green mass surrounded by blue water. The weather was clear. The visibility was perfect. For the mission, that was good. For the crew's survival, it was a problem. Japanese radar picked them up almost immediately. At 7:06 in the morning, Bombardier Joe Sarnosky, in the modified nose position, reported fighters climbing from the Buka airfields below. He counted them quietly over the intercom. 1, 3, 5, 7. By the time Sarnosky finished counting, there were at least 20 zeros in the air and climbing fast. Zeamer had a choice. He could break off the run immediately, turn south, push Old 666's engines to maximum power, and try to outrun the fighters before they reached altitude. He would lose the photographs. The intelligence mission would fail. The offensive planning would be delayed. Or he could hold the course, keep the camera running, and complete the photographic run while 20 Japanese fighters climbed toward him. He held the course. He keyed the intercom and said 5 words: "Stay on the bomb run." The first zeros reached Old 666's altitude at 7:10 in the morning. What happened next was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a sustained, one-sided demolition of a single aircraft by a large formation of highly skilled fighter pilots who knew exactly what they were doing and had overwhelming numerical advantage. The Zeros attacked in coordinated waves. They came from the front, from the sides, from below. They used the standard Japanese fighter tactic against heavy bombers: high-speed firing passes, brief exposures to defensive fire, then climbing away and repositioning for another run. Within the first 30 seconds of the engagement, Old 666 had taken multiple 20mm cannon hits. The nose section absorbed the worst of it. Sarnosky, in the front turret, was hit almost immediately. A cannon shell exploded near his position and tore into his abdomen. The wound was catastrophic. Anyone else would have fallen away from the gun. Sarnosky stayed at his guns. He was bleeding badly enough that the crew could see it from their positions. He was operating on pure will. He tracked the incoming fighters and kept firing, kept reporting their positions over the intercom, kept feeding information to the gunners behind him. In the cockpit, Zeamer felt the impacts through the airframe. The aircraft shuddered with each hit. Warning lights flickered. He heard the damage reports coming in over the intercom, kept his hands steady on the controls, kept Old 666 straight and level. The photographic run required straight and level flight. Any deviation meant the cameras captured useless imagery. The whole mission, the reason they were here, the reason 10 men were flying into this, depended on Zeamer holding that course regardless of what was happening to his aircraft. He held it. For 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the length of the photographic run over Buka Jay Zeamer flew a straight line through one of the most intense fighter attacks of the Pacific War. When the cameras finished their run, he banked Old 666 hard south and pushed the throttles forward. But the Zeros followed. The first cannon shells hit Zeamer himself at approximately 7:15 in the morning. A burst of 20mm fire raked the cockpit from below. Fragments tore into both of Zeamer's legs and one arm. The wounds were serious enough that the co-pilot, Lieutenant Johnny Britton, glanced over and immediately assumed Zeamer would have to hand over the controls. Zeamer did not hand over the controls. He acknowledged the hits over the intercom, told the crew he was still flying, and kept his hands on the stick. The damage to Old 666 was accumulating fast. By 7:20 in the morning, the aircraft had absorbed what ground crews would later estimate as more than 180 cannon and machine gun hits. 2 of the 4 engines were running rough. The hydraulic system was losing pressure. The oxygen system in the rear of the aircraft was damaged. One of the gun turrets had been partially destroyed. And still the Zeros kept coming. In the waist section, Gunner Sergeant Herbert Pugh had taken hits to both legs. Shrapnel had torn through the fuselage and found him as he tracked an attacking fighter. The wounds were severe enough that standing was nearly impossible. Pugh stayed at his gun. In the tail position, Sergeant Forrest Dillman worked his twin .50 calibers against the fighters pressing in from behind. In the top turret, Staff Sergeant John Abel, the navigator who had moved to the guns when the fighting started, kept tracking and firing. In the ball turret beneath the aircraft, Sergeant Leroy Proctor rotated to meet each new threat as it developed. 10 men, every one of them doing exactly what they were supposed to do, in an aircraft that was coming apart around them against an enemy that had every advantage. At 7:22 in the morning, Joe Sarnosky was hit again. A second cannon shell struck the nose position. This one was fatal. Sarnosky was mortally wounded. He kept firing. Witnesses later stated that Sarnosky continued to engage attacking Zeros after receiving his second fatal wound. He was still at his guns when he died. His final actions destroyed at least one Japanese fighter and drove off several others who had been positioning for a killing run on the cockpit. He was 27 years old. Zeamer learned of Sarnosky's death over the intercom at approximately 7:25 in the morning. He had known Joe Sarnosky for over a year. They had flown 47 missions together. Sarnosky had been the one who made the bombing and reconnaissance runs work, the one who understood the cameras and the bomb systems better than anyone else on the crew. Zeamer said nothing over the intercom. He kept flying. The Zeros were still attacking, but their coordination was breaking down. Zeamer's gunners had been hitting them hard throughout the engagement. Multiple Japanese fighters had been shot down or damaged. The remaining pilots were being more cautious, making fewer committed passes, staying at longer range. Old 666 was dying, but it was still dangerous. The Japanese knew it. At 7:35 in the morning, approximately 29 minutes into the engagement, the last Zero broke off and turned back toward Bougainville. The intercom was quiet for a moment. Then Zeamer came on and gave the crew a damage report request. One by one, the survivors reported in. 5 men wounded, 1 dead, 2 engines degraded, multiple systems damaged or inoperative. Still flying, still heading home. What came next was In some ways, harder than the battle itself. Old 666 still had more than 500 miles to cover before reaching Dobodura. The aircraft was so badly damaged that no one could be certain it would stay in the air. The wounded men needed medical attention that was impossible at 25,000 feet. Zeamer himself was losing blood steadily from the wounds in his legs and arm. Somewhere over the Solomon Sea, Zeamer lost consciousness. Co-pilot Britton took the controls and held altitude while the crew worked to stabilize the wounded. When Zeamer came back around minutes later, exactly how many minutes is not clear from the records, he took the controls back without comment and continued flying. He passed out again before they reached New Guinea. Again, Britton took over. Again, Zeamer recovered and took the aircraft back. At 11:10 in the morning, more than 4 hours after takeoff, more than 4 hours after the battle began, Old 666 crossed the coast of New Guinea and began its descent toward Dobodura. Zeamer was barely conscious when the wheels touched down. Ground crews who ran to the aircraft said later that they had never seen a B-17 so badly damaged, still flying. The fuselage looked, one mechanic said, like it had been used for target practice by everyone in the Pacific. The photographic film was intact. The mission was complete. 9 of the 10 men who had taken off that morning were still alive. Jay Zeamer spent the next 6 months in hospitals. The wounds to his legs were serious enough that surgeons considered amputation. They did not amputate. After extensive treatment, Zeamer recovered full use of both legs, though he would carry shrapnel fragments in his body for the rest of his life. He never flew a combat mission again. The Army Air Forces recommended both Zeamer and Sarnosky for the Medal of Honor, one of the very rare occasions in the war when 2 men from the same crew, on the same mission, received the nation's highest military decoration. Sarnosky's Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously. His citation described a man who had remained at his guns through 2 separate fatal wounds, whose final actions in the nose turret had likely saved the aircraft from destruction. Zeamer's Medal of Honor was presented by General Douglas MacArthur in January 1944, while Zeamer was still recovering from his wounds. MacArthur, who was not known for easy praise, reportedly told Zeamer he was one of the bravest men he had ever encountered. The citation read, in part, "His extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service." The other 8 surviving crew members received a combined 8 Distinguished Service Crosses, the second highest military decoration, making the crew of Old 666 the most decorated single crew of any single mission in the entire history of the United States Army Air Forces. Zeamer returned to the United States in 1944. He was promoted to major and later to lieutenant colonel. He spent time in rehabilitation, then in various administrative and training roles as the war continued. After the war, he tried to build a normal life. He married, he worked in business. He moved around, tried different things, found that peacetime didn't fit a man who had been built for something else. He eventually settled into a quiet life, far from the headlines that had briefly made him famous in 1944. He did not talk about the mission much. When he did, he talked about his crew, about Sarnosky, about the gunners who had stayed at their positions while the aircraft came apart around them. "I had the best crew in the Air Forces," he said in one of his rare interviews. "Any one of them would have done the same thing I did. I just happened to be the one in the left seat." Joe Sarnosky was buried in the Philippines. He was from Simpson, Pennsylvania, a small mining town in Lackawanna County. His family kept his Medal of Honor in a glass case in the living room for the rest of their lives. Old 666, the junk heap bomber that nobody wanted, was eventually retired from service. It had flown its last mission. Here is what I want you to understand about Jay Zeamer Jr. He was not supposed to be there, not in any sense of the phrase. The Army Air Forces had looked at him, seen an unconventional pilot who borrowed aircraft without permission, and spent too much time thinking about gunnery systems, and decided he wasn't suitable for command. They moved him around, they passed him over. They essentially told him repeatedly that he didn't fit. He responded by finding the one aircraft nobody else wanted, rebuilding it from the inside out, assembling a crew from the men everybody else had overlooked, and flying 47 combat missions before anyone really paid attention. When the most dangerous mission in the theater needed a volunteer, he was the one who raised his hand, not because he was reckless. Because he had spent a year preparing for exactly this kind of thing, and he knew his crew could do it. He was right. There's a version of this story where Zeamer breaks off the photographic run when the Zeros start climbing, where he turns south, pushes the throttles, saves his aircraft and his crew from a fight he didn't have to take. No one would have criticized him for it. The odds were insane. 20 fighters against one bomber with no escort. The rational choice was survival. But Zeamer knew something the rational calculation missed. He knew why they were there. He knew that the photographs he was taking would be used to plan an offensive, that the intelligence in his cameras might save the lives of thousands of men who would have to fight without it. He stayed on the bomb run. And Joe Sarnosky, a man with a hole in his abdomen large enough that the crew could see the wound from across the aircraft, stayed at his guns for 20 minutes and then died at them. Because the mission wasn't finished yet. Because there were 9 other men on that aircraft. Because some things are worth more than staying alive. Jay Zeamer Jr. died on March 22, 2007. He was 88 years old. He had outlived most of his crew. He had outlived the men who passed him over for command. He had outlived Old 666, which had been scrapped decades earlier. His obituaries mentioned the Medal of Honor. They mentioned Bougainville. They mentioned the 180 holes in the fuselage and the 4 hours it took to fly home. What most of them didn't capture was the thing that made the story worth telling. Zeamer wasn't a hero because he did something no one else could have done. He was a hero because he did something almost anyone might have found a reason not to do, and he did it anyway, without drama, without hesitation, because 9 men were depending on him, and the job wasn't finished. That's the story of Old 666. That's the story of Jay Zeamer Jr. A man nobody wanted, a bomber nobody wanted, a mission nobody else would take. One of the most decorated single crews in American military history. If this story moved you the way it moved us, the way it still moves us, honestly, every time we go back to those records and read what those men did on June 16, 1943, please take a moment to hit the like button. It sounds like a small thing. It isn't. Every like tells YouTube that this story is worth showing to someone new, someone who hasn't heard of Jay Zeamer, someone who doesn't know about Joe Sarnosky, someone who needs to know that the men who changed history were often the ones everyone else had written off. If you want more stories like this, forgotten missions, overlooked heroes, the men and women history left in the footnotes, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We go looking in the archives every week so you don't have to. And leave us a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. We have viewers from across the United States, from the United Kingdom, from Canada and Australia and New Zealand, from every corner of the world where someone still cares about what these men did and why it matters. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us what stories you want us to find next.